Let's head overseas now. And Russians have taken to social media like Twitter and Facebook to vent their anger about the recent parliamentary elections. The poll was marred by allegations of fraud and protests.
To discuss this, we're joined by Professor Leslie Holmes from Melbourne University's School of Political and Social Sciences. Leslie Holmes, good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Morning.
Your take on the people's response to these elections. We've seen nothing like it, really, for many, many years.
Not in Russia, but we have seen it in other former Soviet states. We saw it in Georgia in 2003, yes. In Ukraine in 2004 and in Kyrgyzstan in 2005. And in all those cases, the government was removed. And in all those cases, what triggered it was fraud in the election.
Are we seeing a groundswell of public opposition now to Vladimir Putin?
We're seeing a lot more people coming out on the streets than would have done a few months ago. I personally wouldn't yet say that it's an overwhelming majority, but I think the way it's grown from, say, Monday last week to Sunday of this week suggests that it could really snowball now. You've mentioned about Facebook and Twitter. This is one of the effects of the new technology.
Professor, in your view, is there any doubt that these elections were affected by fraud?
Oh, there's been admission that there's been some fraud, but Putin has said that it doesn't affect more than 0.5% of the votes.
And do you believe that?
I don't, and I don't think most Russians do. Even those who haven't come out on the streets yet would be highly cynical.
So the only way they could have got across the line was by ballot stuffing?
It seems that way. We'll have to wait and see, but I mean, there certainly was some ballot stuffing. We've got evidence of that. It's just a matter of how many seats were affected by it.
And even with ballot stuffing, we saw the United Russia Party get a much smaller vote than last time around. What does that say?
It's that they're losing popularity, that Putin's losing popularity. And for a while, Medvedev has been acting as a counterweight. But since he himself has said that he doesn't agree with what a lot of the demonstrators were protesting against, although he's prepared to look into the election fraud, he's lost a lot of brownie points himself in the last few days.
We know how the traditional Russian power base responds to these sorts of local movements, to groundswells, and often with great violence, and political prisoners are locked up as a result of that. They're accused of being terrorists, they're accused of being Chechens and the like. Do you imagine this is how the power centre will respond to this?
Given Putin's background, one would assume that. But what's interesting is that the early post-election protests did result in arrests, and there were people given fairly short, but nevertheless jail sentences, 2 weeks or so on. But after the last one at the weekend, very little violence, very little arrests. I think Putin and Medvedev really don't know what to do, and they will be looking, as I mentioned earlier, at the so-called coloured revolutions elsewhere in the former Soviet Union, and they will be very nervous.
If they don't know what to do, what else then perhaps rushes into a power vacuum?
Absolutely, because although Prokhorov has now said he will run, there is another chap that's very popular amongst a lot of Russians, a man called Navalny, and I'd certainly be watching him. He's the one who's the blogger about corruption, and a lot of these protests are pro-democracy and anti-corruption, and again, they're very, very similar to the earlier ones elsewhere in the former Soviet bloc.
You mentioned there Mikhail Prokhorov, the billionaire who's now considering running for president. What are his chances, and tell us a bit about him?
He's one of the many oligarchs that made their fortune in the 1990s and have continued to do so in the 2000s. He will appeal to a lot of the business class, but one has to bear in mind that a lot of Russians are very resentful of the ultra-rich. And so although people will be pleased to see that someone's running against Putin, I think they will still be looking for a third candidate.
What we've seen on the streets of Russia has been not just the usual suspects protesting, but lots of members of the middle class who, of course, have prospered mightily under Putin's rule. That is significant in the sense that there could be a big power shift across the country.
Absolutely, and there's a famous political scientist who argued back in the 1960s that in terms of democratisation and democracy consolidating, you need a middle class. They're the only group that can really act as a counterweight to a state bureaucracy. And that middle class has been building rapidly in the 2000s. Maybe we're at the tipping point.
Do we need to keep an eye on the military now, on what it might be thinking and what it might do next?
It hasn't traditionally been as involved in politics as, for instance, in other countries like Turkey, for instance. I mean, I've been studying Russian politics for 40 years. I don't like making predictions, but on past precedent, I don't think that they would come out and get involved.
So we just sit and wait and see what the power twins, the power duo will do, and we'll say.
Yes, exactly. And who else is going to run against them?
And there's no chance that Putin will read the writing on the wall and not run? He's committed to...
I think he can read the writing on the wall, but he doesn't want to.
That's true.
Professor Leslie Holmes, really good to talk to you this morning. Thanks so much.
Thank you.